Hello everyone and welcome to lesson 14.1. I've entitled this video, The Industrial North. This video is going to cover pages 376 to 381. Technology and Industry. The early years of the 1800s saw much innovation in industry and technology. The ways in which Americans worked, traveled, and communicated underwent great change. The new ways of living affected the whole nation, but their effects were most dramatic in the North. Question number 1, what is an innovation? I have that definition on the bottom right here. It is a new idea, method, or device. Question number 2, in what three areas of life did Americans undergo great changes in the 1800s due to all of the new innovations? The way they worked, the way they traveled, and the way they communicated. Three phases of industrialization. Before industrialization, or the Industrial Revolution, workers made most goods one item at a time, from start to finish. To make clothes, a woman might spin the thread, weave the cloth, then cut and sew the fabric. Industrialization changed that way of working. The North's industrialization took place in three phases. During the first phase, employers divided jobs into smaller steps. For example, one worker would spin thread and nothing else. Another worker wove cloth. Each worker specialized in one step and became an expert in it. Two specialized workers could produce more cloth than if each worker did both tasks. During the second phase of industrialization, entrepreneurs built factories to bring specialized workers together. This allowed the product to move quickly from one worker to the next. In the third phase, workers used machines to complete tasks. For example, machines called looms wove cloth using the power of flowing water. The machines worked much faster than any human could. The worker's job changed from weaving to tending the machine. Question number 3. Before the Industrial Revolution, how did workers make goods? One item at a time, by hand, from start to finish. Question number 4. What happened during the first phase of industrialization? Well, during the first phase, the employers started dividing the jobs into smaller steps, and workers would be very specialized with the job that they did. Question number 5. What happened during the second phase of industrialization? In the second phase, entrepreneurs built factories, and then those specialized workers came to one place and they worked together in that factory to make it even more efficient. And question 6, what happened during the third phase of industrialization? During the third phase, workers started using machines to do the tasks, and that made their work go a lot faster, and thus efficiency was also made better, and they could make more product, which means you could lower costs, which means more people can afford them, and these phases of industrialization really helped the American economy. Mass production of cloth began in New England in the early 1800s. Then Elias Howe invented the sewing machine in 1846. Workers could now make clothing in mass quantities by using machine-made fabrics and sewing machines. Question number 7. What invention did Elias Howe create in 1846 that would revolutionize the clothing industry? He invented the sewing machine. Similar changes were transforming other industries and affecting the North's economy. By 1860, the Northeast factories made at least 2/3 of the country's manufactured goods. Question number 8. By 1860, what fraction of America's manufactured goods were made in the factories in the Northeast? At least 2/3. Now, why do they use 1860 as the point to make that an important point? Well, that's right before the Civil War is going to start. So when the Civil War does start, it's going to make a lot of sense why the North wins. We had a vast majority of the country's manufactured goods, things like guns and bullets. So these things that you can make in factories, 2/3 of that and over were made in the northern factories. Changing transportation. Improvements in transportation contributed to the success of the new American industries. Between 1800 and 1850, crews built thousands of miles of roads and canals. By connecting lakes and rivers, canals opened new shipping routes. In 1807, inventor Robert Fulton launched his first steamboat, the Clermont, on the Hudson River. Steamboats made fast upstream travel possible. They carried goods and passengers more cheaply and quickly along inland waterways than flatboats or sail-powered vessels did. In the 1840s, builders began to widen and deepen canals to make space for steamboats. By 1860, about 3,000 steamboats traveled the country's major rivers and canals, as well as the Great Lakes. This encouraged the growth of cities such as Cincinnati, Buffalo, and Chicago. Sailing technology also improved in the 1840s. The new clipper ships featured tall sails and sleek hulls. They could sail 300 miles per day, as fast as most steamships at that time. Clipper ships got their name because they, quote, clipped time from long journeys. Before the clippers, the voyage from New York to Great Britain took about 21 to 28 days. A clipper ship could usually cut that time in half. Question number 9. Based on the information presented in this slide, discuss some ways that transportation was improved during that time period. Well, number 1, we saw the invention of the steamboat, and that was going to be huge. So making the steamboat was going to help travel. Also, building thousands of miles of roads and canals allowed steamboats and other ships to go to more cities in America at a quicker pace. And then you also had the clipper ships, which were a lot faster sailing the seas. Question number 10. What were clipper ships and why were they an improvement over previous ships? Well, clipper ships were the ships that they had these tall sails and the sleek hulls, and pictured here at the bottom, and they could go a lot faster than the ships before them, and that is why they were an improvement. They were able to cut the time it took to travel nearly in half. The railroads arrive. The first railroads in the United States ran along short stretches of track that connected mines with nearby rivers. Horses pulled these early trains. The first steam-powered passenger locomotive began running in Britain in 1829. A year later, Peter Cooper designed and built the first American steam-powered locomotive, and you can see that pictured on the right. The Tom Thumb, as it was called, got off to a slow start. It actually lost a race staged against a horse-drawn train when its engine failed, and you can see a recreation of that in the bottom left. Before long, however, engineers had improved the technology. By 1840, steam locomotives were pulling trains in the United States. In 1840, the United States had almost 3,000 miles of railroad track. By 1860, the nation's tracks totaled about 31,000 miles, mostly in the North and Midwest. Question number 11. Why was the Tom Thumb an important part of America's transportation history? Well, this was the beginning in America of using railroads to help improve our transportation needs. Question 12. By 1860, where were most of America's railroad tracks located? They were located in the North and Midwest, and once again, they pick 1860 because that's right before the Civil War, and once again, the North is going to use this vast advantage of having railroad tracks over the South as another way that they will win the Civil War. The new rail lines connected many cities. One line linked the cities of New York and Buffalo. Another connected Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. Railway builders connected these eastern lines to lines being built farther west in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. By 1860, the nation's railroads formed a network that united the Midwest and the East. Moving goods and people. The impact of improved transportation was felt deeply in the western areas of the country. Before canals and railroads, farmers sent their crops down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. From there, goods sailed to the east coast or to other countries. This took a considerable amount of time and often caused goods to be more expensive. Railways and canals transformed trade in these regions. The opening of the Erie Canal in 1825 and later the railroad networks allowed grain, livestock, and dairy products to move directly from the Midwest to the east. Improvements in transportation provided benefits to both businesses and consumers. Farmers and manufacturers could now move goods faster and more cheaply. As a result, consumers could purchase them at lower prices than in the past. The railroads also played an important role in the settlement of the Midwest and the growth of its industry. Fast, affordable train travel brought people into Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. The populations of these states grew. New towns and industries developed as more people moved into the area. Question number 13. How did canals and railroads transform the Midwest during that time in our history? Well, by being able to build these railroad tracks and connect them with trains, people could move these goods and services back and forth much faster, which made people say, you know what, I can live in the Midwest and still make a good living. I don't have to be isolated. I don't have to live this backwards life. I can be connected to the cities back in the East, and I can make a pretty good living doing this. And there's lots of affordable land out there, so I think I'm going to do that. So it really helped the boom of what we call the Midwest today, and that's where we live. So our history of our own state is definitely affected by this transformation. Progress with problems. As more people moved more quickly along railways and waterways, the possibility of disaster also increased. Some tragic events occurred. The SS Central America was a 270-foot side-wheel steamer that carried passengers and cargo between New York and the Central American country of Panama. The ship traveled one part of a widely traveled route between the East Coast and California. In September 1857, the Central America, pictured top right, was carrying a full load of passengers and a large amount of gold when it steamed into a hurricane. The ship sank off the coast of the Carolinas and hundreds of people drowned. The Great Train Wreck of 1856, pictured bottom right, occurred between Camp Hill and Fort Washington, Pennsylvania on July 17, 1856. Two trains slammed head-on into each other. An estimated 60 people were killed and more than 100 were injured. At that point in time, it was considered one of the worst accidents in railroad history. The tragic news horrified the nation. Newspapers demanded that railroad companies improve their methods and equipment and make the safety of passengers their first concern. Question number 14. While there were some tragic accidents with the new forms of transportation, what role did the media play in improving America's transportation safety? Well, when you have freedom of speech and freedom of the press, those people can write articles in the newspaper and put pressure onto these businesses to make safety a concern, where maybe they weren't giving it a thought before. And so that kind of pressure by the media can lead to improved safety features in all walks of America's life, in this case, in the transportation field. Communications breakthroughs. The growth of industry and the new pace of travel created a need for faster methods of communication. The telegraph, a device that used electric signals to send messages, filled that need. Samuel Morse, an American inventor, developed a system for sending coded messages instantly along electrical wires. After Morse showed his system could send messages over a short distance, Congress gave him money to test the device over a wider area. Morse strung wires between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, Maryland. On May 24, 1844, he was ready to try out his system. A crowd of people watched as Morse tapped out the words, "What hath God wrought?" on his telegraph system. A few moments later, the operator in Baltimore sent the same message back in reply. Morse's telegraph had worked. Question number 15. What revolutionary communication device did Samuel Morse invent in 1844? The telegraph. Telegraph operators sent messages quickly by using Morse code, pictured on the right. This code uses different arrangements of short and long signals, dots, and dashes to represent letters of the alphabet. Telegraph companies formed and workers put up telegraph lines across the country. By 1852, there were about 23,000 miles of telegraph lines in the United States. The telegraph allowed information to be communicated in minutes rather than days. People could quickly learn about news and events from other areas of the United States. The telegraph also allowed businesses to become more efficient with production and shipping. Question number 16. What was Morse code? Morse code is the code that uses the symbols of dashes and dots, as you can see pictured on the right. So when they tap on the telegraph, a long sound is the dash and the short sound is the dot, and those represented numbers and letters. Question number 17. How did the telegraph revolutionize the news and business worlds? Well, obviously, when you had, before the telegraph, something would happen, you would have to send that event through a letter, and someone would have to take it via horseback or maybe by ship, but the point is news could take a long time to deliver. With the telegraph, news could now become something that would spread very quickly. Of course, this is nothing compared to the internet, but if you think about it, this is the precursor to that. This is the start of how we can improve communication to one another. And also in the business world, they could send each other shipping prices, and they could say what they had in their stocks, what they could have stockpiled in their factories. So definitely it was going to help the business world. As of course later on, the telephone would do the same thing. And yes, that would eventually lead to the smartphones that you love today. Farming innovations. In the early 1800s, few farmers were willing to settle in the treeless Great Plains west of Missouri, Iowa, and Minnesota. Even areas of mixed forest and prairie west of Ohio and Kentucky seemed too difficult for farming. Settlers worried that their old plows could not break the prairie's matted sod. They also worried that the soil would not be fertile enough to support fields of crops. Advancements in agriculture. 3 inventions of the 1830s helped farmers overcome difficulties in farming the land. As a result, settlement expanded throughout wider areas of the Midwest. One of these inventions was the steel-tipped plow developed by John Deere in 1837. This allowed farmers to cut through the hard-packed prairie sod. Knowing that they would be able to farm the land on the prairies helped people make the decision to move west. Equally important to the transformation of farming were the mechanical reaper, which sped up the harvesting of wheat, and the thresher, which quickly separated the grain from the stalk. Each of these innovations reduced the labor required for farming. Question number 18. In the early 1800s, why were few farmers willing to try to farm in the treeless Great Plains? Well, 2 concerns. Number 1, they were worried that their old plows couldn't break through the sod, and then even if they could, the second concern was would the soil even be fertile enough to be able to grow crops? How ironic when you think about America today. This is the breadbasket of the United States and arguably the world. We make so much farming food in those areas back then that they thought they wouldn't be able to. Oh, how times have changed. Question 19. What invention did John Deere invent in 1837 that would revolutionize the agricultural industry? He invented the steel-tipped plow. And question 20. Why was this invention so important for the agricultural industry? Well, it was able to cut through that hard-packed prairie sod, and that just opened up so many acres of farmland for people to come in and then plant crops and then grow those crops, and now our country could just expand radically. McCormick's reaper. Cyrus McCormick was the genius behind the invention of the mechanical reaper. Before this invention, pictured here in the bottom left, farmers had harvested grain with handheld cutting tools, such as this sickle. McCormick's reaper greatly increased the amount of crop a farmer could harvest, pictured here. Because farmers could harvest more wheat, they could plant more of it. Growing wheat became profitable. Raising wheat became and would remain the main economic activity on the Midwestern prairies. New machines and the ease of access to railroads allowed farmers to plant more acres with cash crops. Midwestern farmers grew wheat and shipped it east by train and canal barge. Northeast and Middle Atlantic farmers increased their production of fruits and vegetables. In spite of improvements in agriculture, the North was steadily becoming more industrial and urban. Agriculture in the region was still growing, but industry was growing faster. Question number 21. What invention did Cyrus McCormick invent that would revolutionize the agricultural industry? The mechanical reaper. And question 22. Why was this invention so important in the agricultural industry? Well, by making the mechanical reaper, Cyrus McCormick allowed farmers to be able to harvest more wheat. If you can harvest more wheat, you can actually make that a cash crop, which means you can actually make money from it. And if you are encouraged in a capitalistic society like ours to be able to make money on something, then that's going to encourage you to want to do that. And so wheat production grew exponentially at that time, and people then flocked to the Midwest to grow more wheat. And so this was just a huge effect on our nation's economy, especially in the Midwest. And just to show you how times have changed, back in 1850, the average farmer could feed 4 people. So you could have one farmer basically feed, in 1850, his family, or a little bit less than that because an average family back then was a little bit bigger. But the point is, One farmer could feed 4 people in 1850. Now notice how improvements in agriculture changes over time. We move along to 1930, so 80 years later, and now farming production has been able to double. Now a farmer could feed 9.8 or about 10 people. So it went from feeding 4 people in 1850 to 1930 you could feed almost 10. Fast forward that 10 years later, and now farmers could feed over 10 people, closer to 11. 10 years later, farmers could feed 15 and a half people by themselves. 10 years later, the farmers could feed almost 26 people. By 1970, farmers could feed almost 48 people just by themselves. Whoops, I clicked on the wrong button there. By 1980, farmers could feed 75.7 people just by themselves. In 1990, the average farmer could feed 100 people. So think about that. We went from feeding 4 people in 1850 to 140 years later, average farmer could feed 100 people. And then in 2006, a farmer could feed 144 people. In 2023, today, at the making of this video, one farmer can feed 166 Americans. So think about what that has freed up other Americans to be able to do. And we'll talk about that tomorrow in class. Well, thank you so much for watching. Before we go, I have 2 Far Side cartoons for you covering the information from this video. First one is, curses! How long does it take Igor to go out and bring back a simple little brain anyway? And secondly, runaway trains. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.